All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Fall Educate Texas Philanthropy Advocates Policy Convening. First of all, you all that know me know that I'm a bit of an extrovert. So doing this virtually for the first time in almost a decade is definitely not my preference, but I'm so glad that we're able to be together, albeit virtually. We miss seeing all of you. These events have always been the highlight of our work. For their very nature, coming together twice a year to network, to learn, to share ideas, to share a meal, maybe even a cocktail. We know that this convening will be different, but great. I want to share a few opening remarks to frame our conversation over the next 2 days. So thanks for indulging before we turn it over to the stars of the show. These are hard times, to be sure. We are all experiencing this crisis in our own way, but I think the general sense we all feel is one of loss. Loss of connections, relationships, etc. And in the most tragic instance, human lives. My family personally lost an elderly aunt in Mexico over the summer to COVID. We have another very close family friend, only in his late 50s, on a ventilator as we speak, Arne. And almost all of us, whether we're parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, and of course our teachers and administrators, have experienced the way that the pandemic has impacted education literally overnight. Many of us remember when we got the email right around spring break that school buildings were closed indefinitely. Probably no other industry has been more affected so dramatically and instantaneously in education. Y'all know I'm a parent. I'm a mom of 3 boys, 6 to 13, who between my husband and I have been crisis learning since March. My older boys are doing fairly well, but online learning for an active kindergartner is not what we imagined by a long shot. The boys are back in school. My son's first day of kindergarten, is not what we imagined. It was sad and surreal. He asked me if I'd hold his hand as he walked into his new classroom, and I told him I couldn't. Instead of the dreaded lice email we used to receive from school pre-pandemic, now every time there's an email from a teacher or administrator, my stomach sinks. Back to school nights over Zoom. We don't even know what many of our teachers look like because their faces are blocked by masks and face shields. What the pandemic laid bare were facts we as philanthropists and nonprofits and government partners already knew to be true. As philanthropists, through our work, we are keenly aware of the inequities that exist in our society. We know that our most vulnerable Texans bear the brunt of less and lower quality healthcare. They're more at risk of attending a failing school. They don't have the luxury of working from home like many of us do, or living in a single family house with only their nuclear family. They are going to be much more vulnerable to a raging virus, and that's why these folks are dying in higher numbers. What the virus has also laid bare is another fact we've known to be true as philanthropy. The fact that education and health are totally interconnected, that you can't have one without the other, that education isn't just a place where kindergartners come to learn to read, or a place where community college students come to get a few other classes under their belt. It's a place where they come to get food, mental health services, connections to social services, the list goes on. We all feel this loss, but the loss our most vulnerable Texans are experiencing is much more pronounced. Loss of jobs, loss of incomes, months, maybe years of lost education, and loss of too many lives. I've been saying since March that it is in times of crisis that philanthropy shines. We were made for these times. Since day one of the lockdown and the subsequent fallout, philanthropy has been rising to the challenge. Private foundations creating rapid response funds, community foundations raising billions of dollars in a matter of hours, education foundations working directly with districts to determine critical needs of teachers and students and responding on a dime, United Ways running food banks. This is what philanthropy does. So now we find ourselves approaching another Texas legislative session, one we know will be difficult. We're going to talk all about that over the next 2 days. It is reminiscent of the session that started it all. Many of you will remember, because you were with us even back then, that in 2011, before Philanthropy Advocates was TGAC and before TGAC was TGAC, we met at the Capitol on a cold February morning and told legislators 2 things. One, like you, we are working hard to meet the needs of Texans. But philanthropy, too, can't fill the holes left by the state. Texas foundations took a big hit during that 2008 economic recession. Much like now, the endowments took a hit, and philanthropy was struggling to meet the needs of our communities in the same way that the state was grappling with those cuts in 2011. We wanted Texas to know that we could and should be a resource, but we always say philanthropy cannot fill the holes left by the state, certainly not a state the size of Texas. So these are still our messages for lawmakers today. These are still the things that we will come to the Capitol, whether it's done virtually or in person in January. These are the messages that we'll have. And we've grown a bit since then. We're now 54 members strong, representing almost every part of the state. We have a new home and a new name. As a part of Educate Texas and Communities Foundation of Texas, we've been able to grow our capacity and our impact, but our mission remains the same. We are a working funders collaborative focused exclusively on state education policy from cradle to career. We come together to network, to learn, to share ideas. Absolutely, that's what the next 2 days are about. We are a working collaborative. In addition to the networking and the learning we do, we roll up our sleeves and we get to work through our policy work groups and our partnerships with our grantees. Our 4 focus areas of school funding, early literacy, effective teaching, and pathways to college and career have focused since day one. We know that these issue areas are points along the education continuum that are critical to ensuring that 7 million public and higher ed students succeed in school and life. So this afternoon at 2, you will hear about our 2020 Philanthropy Advocates work groups focused on the issues and a whole bunch of the other work that the education policy team has been doing to prepare for this session. We'll take a break on Thursday, and then we'll reconvene on Friday morning for a networking coffee where grant makers will have an opportunity to learn more about us and also tell us how we can better serve you in your work. We'll hear from a brain trust of broadband experts to discuss what will probably be the most important policy issue coming into the session. And then we'll hear from our state's most powerful education policymakers at the state capitol on what we can expect next session. And we know it's going to look and feel different, but we're hopeful that they can shed some light on how different, in addition to a whole lot of other issues. We'll close Friday at lunch with our very own Evan Smith, he will gaze into his crystal ball to tell us what we can expect in the days and weeks to come as the election draws near. There is a lot of uncertainty right now. I think we all know that, but one thing I am certain of is that the role and importance of philanthropy in policy debates has never been more critical. We need your voice at the Capitol, even if we can't do it in person. We need lawmakers to hear from you. Nonprofits, advocacy groups, we know our communities and we know that they are hurting right now, and we're trying to make good decisions about how best to help. Lawmakers will be in the exact same position in just a few short months. So we can be a resource and a thought partner to them. A big tent with an aligned policy message. We need to be helpful to lawmakers as they make difficult decisions. And in our role as philanthropy advocates, we need to play a part in building that tent. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dave Scullin, CEO of the Communities Foundation of Texas, which I call the parent company of EdTex and Philanthropy Advocates, to say a few welcoming remarks. We have been a part of CFT for almost 2 years now, which I can't believe, Dave. And I want to just express to everybody how wonderful it has been to be part of this team and to watch Dave as he leads this group. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dave.
Jennifer, thank you so much. You know, it's not a lot of fun following you. You didn't have to announce yourself as being an extrovert. I think everybody knows that and has known that. But you have a natural charisma and a spunk to your work that just makes us very proud that you're part of the same organization. So great kickoff. Good afternoon, everybody. As Jen said, my name is Dave Scullin, and I am the very proud president and CEO of the Communities Foundation of Texas. And I want to welcome all of the philanthropic leaders participating today. We appreciate your energy and commitment to better pre-K, K-12 public education, and higher education policy here in Texas. And we'll have a great opportunity today and then again on Friday to learn about the opportunities and challenges facing Texas in the 2021 legislative session. Public policy in our state it matters towards making change sustainable, and that's why we at CFT get that, and that's why we are forming this effort to be a leader in this space and convene with all of you. I'm very proud of the role that Educate Texas and philanthropy advocates play in providing data, research, and convening of a big tent across the spectrum of ideas towards something we all share, and that's improving the education climate for everyone here in Texas. We strive to think bigger when it comes to better policy ideas in education. Now, we could not be more pleased with the integration and alignment of philanthropy advocates, formerly TGAC. I don't think we'll use that anymore. I love the new name, with Educate Texas and as part of CFT. Now, every team has a captain, and we're proud to have a talented and committed person like Jennifer Estelin to be part of our team as our leader of philanthropy advocates. And as you know, we also have Priscilla Aquino Garza as our K-12 and higher education policy leader. And we especially appreciate all the support and participation today, as we would not have a meaningful coalition or make a difference without your active financial and personal participation. Thank you for that. I'll now pass the Zoom back to Jennifer to walk us through and lead us to the first presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you. Next up, it is my great pleasure to introduce Emily Ramshaw. I would say Emily is definitely one of my sheroes. Many of us, of course, have been watching Emily for quite some time while she was editor-in-chief at the Tribune. And I personally have wanted to have her speak to this group for years, so I'm delighted that today was the day that we could make that happen. Emily flew the nest earlier this year, I think it was this year, and co-founded the 19th, a national nonpartisan news startup focused on gender, politics, and policy. She serves on the board of the Pulitzer Prize. And Emily will moderate the next part of the session, where we will get to hear from two very well-respected, well-known, well-loved former secretaries of education on how they are thinking about restarting and reimagining learning in the time of COVID and beyond. So thank you again to Emily for taking time out of your busy schedule and your 4-year-old's home quarantine over the last 2 weeks for being here. And thank you so much to Secretary Duncan and Secretary Spellings. And with that, I'll turn it over to Emily.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for including us here at the 19th. I know so many of you, and I'm excited to get to participate. As Jen said, I am Emily Ramshaw. I was the longtime editor-in-chief of the Texas Tribune, and currently I am the co-founder and CEO of the 19th, which is a brand new politics and policy startup at the intersection of women, politics, and policy. And the vision for us at the 19th has been, we soft launched in January, full launch in August. The vision for us has been to elevate the voices of women of color and women off of the coasts in American media with journalism that is entirely free to consume and entirely free to republish by every other news organization in the country. So since our launch, which we've been really excited about, we are being republished right now in more than 260 newspapers all over the country. Univision translates all of our work into Spanish and distributes it. We are lucky to have probably one of the most representative, if not the most representative newsroom in America, with 3/4 of our journalists as women of color. It's just been an extraordinary moment in history to be building something like the 19th, especially given the sort of dual pandemics that we're operating in and under. Obviously the COVID pandemic, which has disproportionately affected women, and in particular women of color in every arena other than mortality rates. Truly the first sort of female recession, and this sort of pandemic within a pandemic of institutional racism, the racial reckoning we've been undergoing in this country and in newsrooms around the country, really, really critical time to be having those conversations as well. And so both of those things, of course, play deeply into the disparities in public education we've been seeing, worsening in this moment in history as we are sort of, navigating these gaps between the haves and the have-nots, between, students who have access to technology, who have engaged parents at home who can help them navigate this virtual environment, whose parents can pay for, in-home care and tutoring versus the kids we're seeing getting left behind in so many ways, either because of, the poverty that they experience, the lack of technology they experience. I mean, this is just really an extraordinary time to think about those kinds of gaps. And I am really honored to get to do that today with two very special people, two icons in this space, Margaret Spellings and Arnie Duncan, who I hope I'm going to see if we can bring them and their faces back onto the screen here as I will start doing quick introductions of them. Let's see, it looks like we've got Margaret on the screen for sure. So Margaret Spellings served as U.S. Secretary of Education under George W. Bush, and before that as a White House domestic policy advisor. Most recently, she served as president of the University of North Carolina system, and today she is the president and CEO of Texas 2036, which is a bipartisan, data-driven effort to break gridlock and advance the future of the state. Welcome. So Margaret, we are thrilled to have you here today.
Thanks, Emily. Thrilled to be here, and kudos to all the organizers, to Jen, to you. It's just terrific to be with a bunch of Energizer bunnies.
Wonderful. And I think we will have Arnie here in a moment if we don't have him right now. But Arnie Duncan served in the Obama administration as U.S. Secretary of Education, and prior to that as CEO of Chicago Public Schools, where among other things he opened more than 100 new schools. He is currently managing partner at Emerson Collective, where he's working to help young people in Chicago trapped in a cycle of poverty and violence break free of that history. So Arnie, thank you so much. Thank you both for being here. Looks like I've got them. Got them both. Great. Big thumbs up. Well, we are here as a group to discuss reimagining education in the COVID era. And this summer, the two of you co-wrote an article in The Atlantic called "These 8 Basic Steps Will Let Us Reopen Schools." We don't need to go through all 8 of those steps, but what were the high notes from you all? Why did you decide to write this article together? And what was the message you were trying to get across? Margaret, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I think we both, and I certainly am not going to put words in Arnie's mouth, my friend, he can speak for himself, but I think we both observed there was a lack of leadership from the federal level, and that some of us needed to speak out and talk about some good practice. And a paramount, obviously, is safety and health, and how schools and school districts could do that, how they look at the data, how they look to their officials, and how they understand what their local conditions are, number one thing. And number two thing, how we think about our workforce, our teachers, and keeping them safe. And then understanding the issues around education. Look, we all know that while health is paramount, there's real suffering going on with school being remote or non-existent. And so how do we think about educating this generation and not leaving them behind? And so we had a few ideas about how to do that virtually, and how parents could keep their students on track and the like.
Arnie, what were the big takeaways from you that you were trying to get across?
Well, she can absolutely put words in my mouth. She said it all. Honestly, not much to add. Just to her first point, just honestly, I think both of us in our own little ways trying to fill what we perceived as just a tremendous leadership gap that is only a gap in my mind has only gotten worse, and that the cost to kids, the cost to education, the cost to parents and teachers has been ridiculously high and largely could have been avoided. And so just trying to help in whatever ways we can. I think we're all trying to do that as private citizens.
Yep. I mean, I know you all wrote that article this past summer. There have been some new studies recently published even in the last week, 2 internationally and 1 in the US, showing no consistent relationship between in-person K through 12 schooling and the spread of COVID. How do you all feel that reopenings are going? Did those studies surprise you, or was that your gut instinct from go?
Well, I think we've learned that there are some things we can do to really minimize and mitigate against the disease. Wearing masks, keeping distant, washing, just clean protocols. Look, it's ironic. We can't think about, yes, it's okay to go to the grocery store, but we can't go to school. So yes, we can do that safely. Obviously, community conditions matter a lot, but we've got to move on, and we have to recognize that not having school or students being home without those connections, without being able to be fed and supported and whatnot, really has a lot of downside.
Mm-hmm. Arnie, what are some of the sort of biggest success stories you've seen as you've watched this sort of, kids going back to school in certain environments?
Well, I think, again, in that absence of federal leadership, it's been pretty devastating. I've just been unbelievably impressed and inspired by leadership at the local level across the country. From the start, I've done a weekly call since March around food distribution with superintendents and nonprofits who fed kids and families in the community From the start, schools aren't just a place of learning; they're social safety nets. That's been amazing to see. Seeing people really take students' social and emotional health very seriously, and telehealth and telemedicine, and teachers and psychologists and social workers checking on folks. That's been amazing. Seen places like South Bend, Indiana, park buses that are Wi-Fi enabled in the poorer communities to try and create Wi-Fi hotspots. You've seen Boston give out 30,000 devices, Chicago give out 100,000 devices. San Antonio, 49,000 kids, very poor district, they gave out 47,000 devices. Places starting to use, Guilford County in North Carolina figured out sort of who their best teachers were and had them prepare 3 weeks worth of lessons to start the school year, and then use other teachers to sort of do office hours and sort of small group tutoring or one-on-one tutoring, individual instruction. So you've seen just extraordinary leadership. There's no playbook for this. No one was trained how to do this. They're learning together. They're doing it humbly. They're doing it with urgency. And so that's actually been unbelievably inspiring to witness.
Awesome. I love that you have those examples. So, the U.S. obviously has a long history of race-based differences in educational access and outcomes. And since the pandemic began, there have been a lot of articles published documenting the widening gaps between racial and economic groups in these areas. Back in April, we at the 19th wrote an article profiling a teacher in West Philadelphia who said to us that the pandemic is exacerbating long existing inequities in all areas of society, but perhaps nowhere more acutely than in education. How have you all seen that playing out at the local level, and what are the sort of best and quickest solutions for addressing it? And Margaret, do you want to talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, I think the first is to recognize that that's true, and two, to commit to do something about it. We cannot have kind of an attitude about it. We have to double down and do everything we can to make sure that this is months of learning loss, not years of learning loss. Across the political spectrum and the ideological spectrum, the academic community, we all know if we don't pull up and help these kids, they will suffer, we will suffer long-term economic loss. And so a commitment. And I think there's a lot of things in our toolkit around that. The NAEP results are out today and show us some really bad returns around reading once again. And we all know if you can't read sufficiently or proficiently, you're in a world of hurt. And so tutoring and best practices, use of technology that embeds that assessment and monitoring. I mean, we need to throw every resource we have at this challenge and address it, and we can. And so I hope that we'll see a state and federal leadership around this as we head into our legislative session here. And if I could just have a little call out quickly to the higher ed community, we really need our best researchers, our best scholars to help us figure out what's working and where, and at least learn some things from this chaos we're in the midst of.
I mean, I want to follow up on that quickly when you talked about the sort of state and federal responsibility. Reiterate or expand a little bit about what that responsibility looks like to you, particularly in states where there have been administrations that have been loath to spend additional money on public education.
Well, we need another stimulus, just simple as that. States have fiscal challenges now, and we need state and local support. And we need it targeted at education. I'll talk about how, yes, we need Operation Warp Speed on vaccines and distribution, but we need Operation Warp Speed for kids. And some resources around these challenges and a commitment, a federal and moral imperative to address these gaps.
Mm-hmm. Arnie, you talked a little bit about some of those success stories. On the flip side, what are you seeing on the ground? You're on the ground in Chicago, for example, right? I mean, I don't know if that's where you are physically right this moment, but you've been spending a lot of time in those communities. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing as far as, anecdotally, are you seeing this widening gap the same way that we're hearing about it in all these reports?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the larger issue is not just here in Chicago, but across the country. If you look at the reports nationally, what we're hearing, Margaret's talked about this a little bit in Texas, that we're seeing 2 to 3 million kids who have not been to school since March. I mean, that's sort of stunning, but that's coming back very consistently. And those by definition are the kids that are sort of most marginalized, most vulnerable, most disenfranchised. And so if we don't find those kids like today and get them the help they need and get them the support they need, they're going to be so far behind, they never catch up, or they literally just might not come back. So for me, that's like not just the educational, that's the moral imperative. and we can talk, a lot about technology and what we need to do, and devices, broadband. But we got to go do some home visits, and we got to go knock on doors, and we just got to go spend time with the families and find out what's going on. And that, for me, is the most urgent thing we can do to try and address the challenges that we're seeing again across the country.
And so you're talking
quickly, Emily, if I could add on the Texas data to Arnie's point, I mean, it's 250,000 fewer students, 6% enrollment drop in Texas. We're normally a growing state, and it's particularly showing up in our early grades and in pre-K. And so, warning.
Yep. And so you're talking about kids who aren't even doing virtual school. They're just not enrolled, or they're not showing up, correct?
Yes, they are out of the school system. Right. Physical, virtual, hybrid, they have disappeared, and we have to go find them.
Well, I mean, and so what is going to find them look like in the COVID era? I mean, you're talking about home visits. Do you literally mean in this moment we should be, folks should be masking up and doing home visits to track down those kids?
I absolutely mean that. I'm not, I'm very literal here. And it's funny, the work that I've been doing, we've had to sort of close our offices on the south and west sides, but it's getting a little colder now, but I'll spend a lot of time on porch steps talking to guys. It's actually been really, really helpful. I want to keep doing that you're meeting them where they are. There's an informality there. There's get a sense of living situations, and it's really helped to build some much, much stronger relationships. So it's been, invaluable to me, and hopefully it's been helpful for the guys I'm working with. And so, yes, we should absolutely put a mask on. We have addresses, we probably have phone numbers we can text. We got to go knock on doors and, sit outside, do whatever, sit socially distance. But we have to talk to those kids. And Margaret's one of these, a lot of younger children. We have to talk to their parents, moms, dads, whoever, grandma, whoever it might be, and find out how we help them engage and how we bring them back in. And as school districts try and reopen, and they're trying, again, it's so hard because the virus is still, it's almost like at record levels now, which is just mind-boggling to me how irresponsible we've been. But as you start to prioritize who you bring back, I would argue really strongly that we have to prioritize those kids who have been out the longest to bring them back first and figure out what needs, what do we do to help them. My son and daughter would love to go back. They're doing okay. They're okay. They got 3 meals a day. They got a roof over their head. They got access to technology. There's kind of trade-offs I never had to make in education, but maybe my kids, just hypothetically, maybe my kids can only go back to school once a week, and other kids in their class might need to go back to school 3 or 4 times a week. That's the kind of conversation. Talk about equity, talk about systemic issues of racism or whatever. We have to start to have those harder conversations that we haven't had to in the past.
Right. A question coming in on this particular topic from Kim Coffrin. Do we know how many of the kids who aren't enrolled in public school have switched to private, charter, or homeschooling, particularly pre-K? For example, I'm a parent of a pre-K kid who is enrolled in public school. We basically pulled her out and kept her in daycare this year because the virtual schooling was so difficult. Is there any sense of how much overlap we're talking about there, or are these a lot of sort of, kids from impoverished families who are just off the grid?
I think we don't know exactly yet. Charter school students obviously would show up in the ADA reporting, so no. But to your point and your own incident, Emily, we don't know that quite yet. Mm-hmm. But I think our presumption is that, this is a real warning. Maybe there is some factor there of people like you, but for the most part, I think these kids are lost.
A warning sign for sure. We've talked about sort of manually, physically, how we track down those kids. Let's talk about technology. In the article that we wrote that I was mentioning a few minutes ago, the teacher we profiled in Philadelphia, for example, had many students with no internet access at all, no computer. She said 60% of her students she literally had not even been able to get in contact with, and these were high school kids. How should we be relying on technology in this moment to work for every student and every teacher? Or is this just, an impossibly enormous task for either of you?
Well, I'll just say that the Texas example, Mike Morath, our commissioner, has done a good job of trying to get devices out. We've purchased, tens and hundreds of thousands of devices, hotspots and things like that. We've largely addressed the digital divide in our urban communities. We still have giant divides in our rural communities. So, we're working on it. We are one of just 6 states in the country that do not have a digital broadband plan, which makes us ineligible for federal funds. And so we certainly need a plan, but we can't do only that. We need to address these gaps immediately. And I think one thing that is a hard lesson we've learned is that people understand the value of this. And to your point about the story, those are students that, if you're having virtual school and you have no remote digital access, you're out.
Right. Exactly. Arnie, any additional thoughts on that, or did she cover it?
Yeah, no, this is what I think what honestly infuriates me about education, about the country. This is not finding a cure for cancer. This is not putting a man on Mars. It's not too big. It's just a lack of will. It's a lack of courage. And we just need to say that now more than ever, pandemic, post-pandemic, that kids need to be able to learn anything they want, anytime, anywhere. That we can't confine learning to a physical building 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, 9 months a year. And we just got to make access to technology and broadband as ubiquitous as access to water and electricity. We sort of committed to those things as a country, and we got them done. And this is, I would argue, probably much easier than doing that. There are things, with the FCC and E-rate where you could, have a significant play if there are folks that were, cared about this stuff, make us, billions of dollars there and figure out some public-private partnerships, and you could get this done. This is not an absence of knowledge. It's not an absence of resources. This is an absence of will. And that for me is just, that's untenable.
Yeah. Let's talk about educators for a moment. Obviously, so the 19th focuses on gender. So our stories are through a gender lens. Last month, we wrote about the 865,000 women who had left the workforce in September. A lot of those women were teachers. What, in your view, has the pandemic, what kind of effect has the pandemic had on women's participation in education, both as learners and as educators?
Arnie, you start with that one.
Well, I'll just say that people's respect for teachers has probably never been higher. Parents' appreciation for the difficulty of being a teacher has never been higher. You think about young moms trying to raise their kids and teach simultaneously, and it's not impossible, but it's extraordinarily difficult. And I think that we have to figure out how we better support our teachers, women and men. I would argue, these are larger issues, how we pay better, how we compensate better, how we train better. There's a lot that, in my opinion, is broken on the teacher prep, teacher education, mentoring, induction, all this stuff. There's so much along that continuum from 18-year-olds to 65-year-olds that we have to do better. And again, for me, the goal is not to go back to normal, because normal didn't serve millions of kids well enough, or so many educators well enough. So we have to sort of use this time to reimagine, reinvent. But I think about the loss of that talent, for our kids. And, women, moms are going to do what they have to do for their family. They have made unbelievably rational, difficult choices that maybe broke their heart, but they had to do that. But that's a real loss. And, can we bring them back? How do we recruit the next generation of teachers? These are some sort of bigger sort of macro issues that we, to Margaret's point, we need a plan. We need a strategy, not that we're going to solve overnight, but over the next 5 years, 8 years, how do we benefit from all that wisdom? Somehow, can they be master teachers? Can they be mentor teachers? Can they take young teachers under their wing? And then how do we create the next generation of talent that can thrive in this hybrid world that may become more of the norm than the exception going forward?
And just to add to that, Emily, we've seen a lot of data about how teachers are really in despair and thinking of leaving the profession and on. And we need to really double down on our support for them right now. It is hard to have 12 kids on a screen and to have 12 little bodies trying to keep their masks on and trying to teach them all something and keep your own wits about you. It's always a hard job, but especially now.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we think about all of these different elements, we have an audience here that is deeply invested in how philanthropy can help and can help solve some of these problems. What do you think or see as the biggest opportunities for philanthropy to help address all of these issues that we've laid out in this moment? What are the sort of most obvious areas where philanthropy should be playing?
Well, one thing that comes to mind that I think is kind of low-hanging fruit and sort of, an easy thing to do and pretty affordable is, we need to be harnessing our higher ed institutions into helping us understand what is happening, what are we learning, the various models that Arnie talked about, Guilford County versus South Bend versus, let's take a look under the hood at some of these practices and learn some stuff. And it seems to me that the higher ed has been kind of on the bench at the moment, and as opposed to a problem solver around some of these policy issues that we desperately need their guidance around. We need their guidance around how we think about assessment and accountability and deploying human capital and what challenges teachers are facing and on and on. So having run 14 teacher preparation programs and a lot of business schools and whatnot, I would love to see those assets brought to bear to help us understand what's happening.
Arnie, any thoughts from you on how philanthropists should play, how philanthropy should play?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. And again, you sort of think short-term and long-term. So the crisis, again, for me, is those kids who have disappeared. And so whatever resources, and this should be a philanthropy plus school districts, again, partnering, but whatever resources we need to deploy to go find those kids, that is the top of the list for me. Secondly, how we close that digital divide. So if kids don't have access to technology, they don't have access to the Wi-Fi, philanthropy can step up there big time. Third is when you find those kids, what do you do with them? Kids are going to be 8, 10, 12, 14 months behind. It's just, there's going to be a massive, COVID slide and summer slide. And now, I don't know what we even call this, the fall slide. Margaret and I have talked a lot about a national tutoring initiative that we would, virtually, physically, hybrid, way, work with those kids to help them catch up. We don't need another study about the impact of high intensity tutoring. We know it's a very effective way to catch kids up individually, small groups, whatever it might be. So those would be a couple things that I would do right now. I would find kids, I would make sure kids have access to technology, and I would do what we need to do educationally and then also socially, emotionally to help those kids that their education's just sort of been decimated by this experience.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions pouring in the Q&A, so I'm going to start grabbing some of those. Here's one from Lewis. Who says, the current education secretary has used this crisis to press a school privatization agenda, including the diversion of public funds to private schools. Given the role that neighborhood public schools are playing as social safety nets, have you reconsidered your own positions on school choice, either of you?
Here's the thing. I'm for school choice, but we know for sure that our public schools are a major institution, and the vast majority of students are going to be served or not therein. And so it's cute, but it's a little bit off the point. In my view, we need leadership around public education, around the things that Arnie and I have been talking about. But sure, I'm for it. On a sunny day, let's go,
Arnie, anything from you on that?
This pandemic doesn't know whether you go to a public school or a parochial school or private. It just doesn't know. To Margaret's point, 90% of kids in America have always gone to public schools. 90% of kids in America will always go to public schools. And we need to make sure that those are functioning as best they can anytime, but especially now.
A question in the chat about the CARES Act. D. Thompson asks, what about the CARES Act funding was helpful for state education funding issues? And what do you hope is different about a rumored second round of federal stimulus funding that would make it better for states in addressing education issues, i.e. increased flexibility in spending, et cetera?
Yeah, there's been a lot of flexibility in spending, so much so that a lot of the resources that have been deployed in Texas have not yet been spent. Either in school districts or cities or counties or wherever. So I want to, while we state taxpayers might like supplanting resources to keep, the budget in check next session, what those resources are really for are for critical needs right now today. And so I hope that while we need flexibility about how to use them, that the number one principle is let's spend these resources on things we so critically need. And I think that'll be true in another CARES Act. But sure, we need all the support we can get. We can't print money at the state level, but the feds can.
Arnie, you in particular have talked about the role of public-private partnerships in the educational sphere. How can those types of relationships right now support and improve, educational outcomes for students and educators? I mean, both in normal times, but in particular in pandemic times.
Well, I think it depends obviously on the level of resources, the level of partnership, that kind of stuff. You can play at the federal level. There's some things that work really well there. There are things you play at the state level. There are things you play at the district level. And there are things you can play at the individual school level. So you got to sort of figure this out of what's the amount of resources, what's your scope, what's your scale. I guess the only sort of themes that would be important to me is that the philanthropic dollars are always going to be a very small percent of public resources going into this. So it's going into this work sort of humbly. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to leverage public resources behind what you're doing. Maybe doing something that's a little more cutting edge, maybe doing something that's a little more risky that tax dollars have more challenges with, and trying to demonstrate some models and move forward. But so one, just being honest and realistic about what you can do. The second thing I always just argue for is focus. So, I mean, there's a million things you could do after school. You could do arts education. You could do STEM. You could do, it's a million things, and they're all important. And they're all critical. I would just ask funders to, figure out what their passion is and try and stay with that. And then my final point would be what really troubles me sometimes, honestly, about philanthropy is they'll do something for 2 years, 3 years, then move on to something that's, the new sexy object or whatever it is. And all these things are long, systemic, endemic challenges. And so I would just say, whatever you choose to focus on, just try and stay with it for, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years. And that may not, again, I get the allure of the next shiny object, but these changes take time, and I promise you, you'll be much smarter, and your dollars will be much more wisely used in year 6 than they are in year 1. You'll be figuring out what works and what doesn't. So just staying focused and staying the course for me are sort of the themes that I'd like folks to think about.
As someone who is philanthropically funded, I would like to say a giant amen to that. Sustaining support. Margaret, from your time in higher education, how do you think that colleges and universities will change, through this pandemic and out the other side? I mean, many public institutions have been facing, large cuts from state legislatures. Students have seen tuition rates skyrocketing. Is COVID-19 going to accelerate these trends, or where do you think we're going to be on the other side of this?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, here's the thing. We have had the luxury of having a proliferation of programs in a lot of places. So if you want a PhD in French literature, you can get it in 15 places in Texas. And I'm not sure we can afford to do that. So we're going to have to tighten our belts in higher education. And of course, with online learning, if you're in Dallas, Texas, you can get a PhD in French literature at the University of Houston. And so we have to think about how we're going to allocate resources around a system so that we can meet the needs and interests of our employers and of our citizens. Thing number one. Thing number two is, we need to think about our human capital in higher education. And what are we preparing? Who are we preparing? And do we have the right linkages with our employer community? I like to say that, there are 29 million people in Texas today. Our number one asset as a state is not the oil and gas industry, or not the tech industry, or not the medical, it's our people. And so if we play this hand right, we're large, we're growing, we're diverse, we have everything going for us, but we have to make sure that we have those linkages between what we're preparing in our schools and universities and the linkages into the economy.
Right. Speaking of people, Mark Williams asks, obviously the pandemic is a crisis for our current educators, causing many to leave the workforce. Looking forward, it seems like these issues could and will exacerbate the challenges of attracting enough high quality talent to be educators in the future. What do you see as the challenges and the opportunities we should be addressing now to help strengthen public education and recruitment post-pandemic?
Well, to Arnie's point, I think we need to reimagine and reinvent. And so they're not coming into the same old job that we have today, that we have the technological support, that human capital, our professional capital, is allocated in ways that make sense and is doable. I mean, this model we're doing right now is completely unsustainable. No one in their right mind would want to continue to try to work in an environment like that. And so our challenge will be to how do we make it attractive by reinventing it. But I'm confident, we have a generation of young people who want to make a difference. They want to add value in this world, and there's no better way to do that than being a teacher.
Perfect. And this has been a conversation obviously largely focused on education nationwide, but there are some questions in the Q&A around Texas in particular. Chloe Sykes asks, what would you say to lawmakers about the need to sustain state funds for K through 12 and higher education in Texas's upcoming legislative session? That's a Margaret question for sure.
Okay, well, and I've been encouraged and pleased that all of our legislative leaders have said we're going to protect and defend House Bill 3, the important reform that we had that was, multi-billion-dollar investment, including almost $1 billion in early childhood. Obviously, it's driven by an ADA system, and so when we have shrinkage in the student body, then there will be less resources. But that's why another reason to go find those students. But so far, so good. But it'll all get down to the trade-offs in budgeting at the end of the day. But I know this group and certainly Texas 2036, we will be strong advocates for supporting those investments. And if we don't, it will be at our peril and will pay for a long time.
Great. This is a Texas question, but I think it's one Arnie can answer. Tracy Wickett asks, the Rio Grande Valley in Texas is seriously impacted by the digital divide. It may be the most profound equity issue of our time. Access is essential, but it requires a huge commitment to these families. How are we going to get it done? Whether it's in the Rio Grande Valley or any places in the country where access to broadband and to technology is this enormous. How do we close that gap or narrow that gap?
Well, I'll let Margaret start because she understands obviously the Texas issues a million times better than I ever will. So you start, then I'll add on.
Well, one of the things, and I think, those of us who've been involved in things like Connected Nation and various other coalitions, we've done a great job of framing the problem. People get it. We need broadband everywhere for telemedicine, for e-commerce, for learning. What we have not done is figured out the solutions for how do we create an economic market that makes it attractive to serve communities like that. Do we need regulation? Do we need funding? Do we need both? Carrots, sticks, federal role, state role? And so just pounding on the table and saying we need broadband is not sufficient. We need to be able to answer the question when our legislature asks, what do you want us to do? And so that's why a plan is a great first step, but not only that, how do we create an economic market to provide this service?
Arnie, anything you want to add, or I can hit the next one here since there's a big...
I guess this big picture for me, what the challenge always in education is those of us, I assume, us three doing this conversation, we're lucky enough to be able to take care of our kids, and many folks are. And the question, which again, I think the pandemic is laying bare, is it enough to take care of our kids, or do we have to take care of our neighbors' kids as well? So for all those legislators, for all the people thinking about this, I guarantee you 99.9 of them, their kids do have access. They've made sure they do. And so the question is just, do we value those kids that live in those more impoverished communities, those more isolated communities? Do we think they're as smart, as talented as our kids? Do they think they deserve the same opportunities? And I'd make a pretty compelling case. I would argue they need more opportunities than my kids do. But that's not the mentality. It's like let's take care of ours and let everybody else figure it out for themselves. That's what's broken about our handling of the pandemic, and that's what's broken in education. That's the philosophical shift that has to happen. We got to want as much for our neighbors' kids and make sure they get it as we do for our own.
Seth Rao asks, should states hold normal standardized testing next spring? And if so, should Texas and other states continue their current accountability systems? How do y'all feel about testing and accountability systems in a pandemic?
We absolutely need assessment, and I really commend Commissioner Morath for his strong statements about this. Most school districts have done diagnostic testing this fall, and I think parents want to know where are their students. So let's not shirk from measurement and assessment. Now, on accountability, it's a whole different deal. I think we have to recognize the issues around us. But what are some things that could be indicators? I mean, should we hold our school districts accountable for finding these 250,000 students that are missing? Should we be thinking about how many minutes, how many hours are students learning productively? So what are some things that we can learn short of, you know, the methods that we've had, the grading systems and whatnot? But, you know, if we take a pause, it should be a short-term one, if at all, because we know who gets left behind when we mask and worry less about, you know, who cares?
Any thoughts on that one, Arnie?
Yeah, this is where I think Margaret and I just see the world identically. I don't know how you begin to help kids unless you know where they are. It'd be like you just went to the doctor's office, the doctor just starts shooting you with medicine without asking you any questions. How are you feeling? What's going on? Just randomly doing things or doing nothing. And when you go to the doctor, they ask a bunch of questions to find out how you're doing and then sort of move forward accordingly. We have to have the same thought in education. I will say Texas is no different than any other state. I promise you there are districts that are handling this difficult time masterfully, beautifully, in a world-class manner. I also promise you there are other districts that aren't doing this so well, not for lack of commitment or effort, but just not, maybe haven't quite figured some things out. Does anyone in Texas know who's doing what better or why? Is it how are we learning from each other? The only way I know how to do that is to assess now, assess at the end of the year, and see who's made the most progress in this difficult time. For me, it's never about an absolute result. It's about growth and gain. Who's helping kids catch up? You know, how are we, you know, how can we broaden the definition of accountability? Are we feeding enough kids? Are we taking care of their social and emotional health? Or do we know who they are? Have we knocked on enough doors? Have we brought them in? Those 250,000 kids, how many districts are there in Texas, roughly?
1,100.
1,000 districts, more than 1,000 districts. Who's doing the best job of bringing in their lost boys and girls? Mm-hmm. You guys should want to know that. Who's doing the least good job? Who's in the middle? With absent facts, ignorance is not bliss here. It's just
now,
not.
Emily, I just have to add, when we look back, and I take no joy in this, believe me, but when Bush was governor and we had a laser focus on reading and teachers training and resourcing around that, we were in the mid-30s on our National Education Report Card. Today, we're at number 46. And so, yes, we're thrilled that the legislature pulled up and did those investments last session. But when you stop paying attention to every kid being able to read, you know, you lose ground, and they do.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You've made the case to me. I have to tell you, when I was doing a public school pre-K assessment with a 4-year-old via Zoom at the beginning of this school year, everyone in my household was crying. But I think going forward, you're right. I mean, it makes sense. There's no way to actually sort of gauge progress, and it's not for kids of privilege like my daughter. It's so we make sure we're not falling further behind. So well said. Sandy asks, with the presence of pods and at least current frustration with public schools over confusing state and federal policies, some use of pods and other processes, will public schools lose those students and families permanently, or what can they do to bring them back? Thoughts on pods and whether public school parents are sending their kids to private school as a result? Trying to find a way to keep those kids.
Arne, go ahead.
So again, where parents want to exercise their choice, they should absolutely do that, and they have the right to do that. I think again, that's a privileged position to be in, to be very clear. You look at the tens of millions of people across the country who have lost jobs, families that, you know, may have had a chance to afford a parochial tuition or something, where that's no longer an option. And so I think, again, it's just incumbent upon us. All those other options are fantastic, but that's going to be for 8 to 10% of our nation's children. We have to continue to focus on what we're doing for the 90% of children. And there are more and more families that are in poverty. There are more and more families that are food insecure, and helping those, you know, schools and school districts, again, reach them. We talk about educationally, socially, emotionally, in terms of food. And again, with folks in philanthropy on the call, thinking about all those things holistically, helping school districts plan and strategize how to do that. I think that's in everybody's best interest.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to go another 5 to 10 minutes here. So if your final questions, throw them in. Tim Hayes asks, what do you recommend states do to increase the diversity of the teacher and leader workforce? This is not just a challenge in a time of pandemic. What are the big picture things districts should be doing?
Arnie's done a lot on that. You should talk about it. You've been a great spokesperson for those.
Yeah, well, maybe we've talked about it. I honestly don't feel we did a good job on this one. So when we talk about sort of reinventing, where we go with public education, we talk about, a lot of teachers, unfortunately, thousands and thousands who left the profession, and the need for more talent. If we come back with talent that doesn't reflect the diversity of our country, that's an insufficient response to the challenge. I was going to be really clear here. There are lots of studies about how important it is for Black kids to have Black teachers in their life, and that is real and Latino. But I also think it's very important for my children to have Black and Latino teachers in their lives, and male teachers. So if you look across the country, less than 2% of our teachers are Black men of color. Less than 2% are Latino men of color. We have a lot of boys growing up in single parent, largely single mother homes. Those boys need role models. So thinking about racial diversity, thinking about bringing more men into the profession, thinking about how we work better with our HBCUs and our minority serving institutions, thinking about how we challenge our schools of education, not to just take whoever walks in their door, but to actively recruit and reach out to those communities. Thinking about how we start to create future teacher programs for young people in high school is really important. And people like Marian Wright Edelman runs the Children's Defense Fund. She's got the Freedom Schools that have been really, really effective. And so basically summer programs. And what she's done is she's given lots of young men and young women, but I'll focus on young men of color, the chance to teach in the summer. And a lot of guys I talk to, they want to become an accountant, they want to become a lawyer. They go teach for a summer and it changes their life. They see their connection. They see how much the kids need them. And it just opened the door. But absent that sort of opportunity, there's no chance they would have considered that. So those sort of early internships, summer programs, very strategically, creating a pipeline. I guess, keep going back to Margaret's word. We have to recognize the problem. We have to have a plan and a strategy, and we have to hold ourselves accountable for moving on that. And it's just a place where we just, as a country, we haven't had urgency. We haven't had a plan. We haven't had a strategy. You could add some resources here. So I don't want to say it's free, but this is honestly sort of much more a game plan for me than a massive, massive influx of resources. The final thing I'll say is that often in the minority community, folks who go through college have more debt. They're also responsible for other members of the family in terms of bringing in income. And so there are lots of people I've talked to who would love to teach, but they have to go get a more lucrative job because they have to, they have responsibilities, they have debt, they have, other folks they have to take care of. So thinking about, loan forgiveness programs, thinking about, increased scholarships to go into teacher prep programs, we have to be a lot more creative in that space.
And just to add to that quickly, having overseen 14 teacher preparation programs in a big public university system, the #1 preparer of teachers in that state is, again, our HBCUs, our MSIs, we have to make it a priority, but not only there, but everywhere. I mean, our flagship universities need to make teaching a core priority. I mean, don't talk to me about social justice and then eliminate or de-emphasize your teacher preparation program, because it is at the heart of that mission, if you will. And so I think we can do it. And again, I completely agree with Arnie. It's not a matter of resource. In fact, I think our HBCUs often have a better understanding and do a better job of preparing teachers to be in the kinds of communities and classrooms that they're going to see in real life than you see in other institutions. So it has to be a leadership issue in higher ed.
Well, someday I'm going to have a conversation with the two of you and ask you what you disagree on, because you seem to agree on so many of this. But the last question, audience question we hear the term build back better after COVID. What could that look like for public ed, and what is the sort of lowest hanging fruit to building back better?
Well, I'm going to start on your last tacky comment, and that is that, yeah, we do have a lot in common, and that's always been true. That's why No Child Left Behind passed with Ted Kennedy's strong leadership, 87-10 in the Senate and whatnot. And we have always had, through our history, strong consensus around a belief in our public schools and what it takes to make them work. Strong teachers, an understanding of the civil rights underpinning that is our public school system, a fealty to data and reading, and I mean, on and on. And so when we think about building back better, I think we need to restore that consensus, that coalition, the civil rights community and the business community, our teachers and professionals, and parents. And so we can do that. Let's all get on the same page again and do what works.
Arnie?
Yeah, I'll say two things. One, just on the personal side, Margaret and I have always seen eye to eye on lots of things, not everything, but I just publicly say, learning from her and her job, building some relationship with her, having someone to bounce ideas off of. When I was struggling with the tutoring program in Chicago, she gave me some flexibility that she didn't have to do. That was a huge deal for me and helped me serve about 25,000 more kids after school better than other folks were doing. So one is a personal thing, but two, I think what we both fundamentally get is that education is not Republican or Democrat. Education is not left or right. There's nothing partisan about any of this, and we just got to give kids a chance in life. And one of the things we pushed really hard was more community college and free community college. Well, who did that best was Governor Haslam, Tennessee. He actually did it. Happens to be a Republican. He did it in a way that 49 other states didn't, because he figured it out that was really important to him. He was an amazing education leader. So the fact that somehow, it's just, I call it adult dysfunction. When we start to debate on ideology, it's small ball. Let's debate the best ways to raise graduation rates, best ways to get more kids in pre-K, more kids into college, more kids graduating. There are lots of strategies to get there, and we can have, try lots of different things, but those are nation building things. Those aren't left or right things. So I just think we just do kids a real disservice when we get caught into where I see the small ball stuff to score some cheap political points that have nothing to do with helping our country. To your larger point, just a couple things to think about. These aren't easy or low-hanging fruit, but I just would challenge us to think about things that we have taken for granted for a century or more, I think need to change. I think the length of the day has been standard. Some kids need 6 hours a day. Some kids need 8 hours a day. Some kids need 12 or 14 hours a day. And we got to do for kids what they need. Some kids need 1 meal a day. Some kids need 3 meals a day. And I don't mean sitting at a desk for 14 hours a day, but dance and drama and arts and music and Model UN and band and sports and chess and all those things that give kids a reason to be excited about coming to school. We have to do that. I think summer is obsolete, particularly for kids that are behind. Our kids aren't working the fields anymore. Why do we take the summers off? And for those kids that are furthest behind, they need to be in school 11 months out of the year, 12 months out of the year, whatever it might be. We have to think about that. I think K-12 is obsolete. It's insufficient. I think we got to pre-K, and high school diploma is, again, great, but it's not enough. It's got to be some form of higher education, 4-year university, 2-year community college, trade, technical, vocational training. We have to move from a K-12 model to a pre-K to 14 model. And then the final thing is, and again, technology is forcing us now, is to move from seat time to competency. That you need to be able to move when you master something. So my example is, you don't pass algebra because you sit in algebra for 5 days a week, an hour a day for 9 months. You pass algebra when you know algebra. And that might be in 3 months, it might be in 5 months, it might be in 9 months, it might be in 15 months. So those are not easy, they're not low-hanging fruit. But if we're going to really try and do something different and meet kids where they are, all kids where they are, there are a set of things that have been constant for all that have been fixed, and those have to be variable based upon kids' needs and interests and abilities.
Can I agree with that?
Please, I hope you do. Well, thank you both so much for your leadership and for your compassion and for setting such an extraordinary example for bipartisanship and what working together for a better future for our nation's kids can look like. It's really extraordinary to get to be up here on this Zoom screen with both of you. And I know that all of our attendees were thrilled to get to be with you. You both, Arnie and Margaret, are good to turn off your cameras, I've been instructed, after you wave a big goodbye to your audience here. And then Jen, thanks you both. And then Jen, I'm going to throw it back to you all.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you, Secretary Spellings and Secretary Duncan. That was fantastic. I was just sort of thinking about, reflecting on the fact that you all have very busy day jobs and you could be doing all of that and not worrying about running around the country, at least virtually, talking about these issues, doing the op-eds, having a very public presence over the last several months since the pandemic hit. And we just really appreciate you. We consider Margaret, of course, to be a Texas treasure, and we're really, really pleased to have Arnie with us as well. It is my job now, and I'm happy to say we're going to give you all a little bit of time back. And the reason we are doing that is because what we have up next for this session, for the day, is that there's a pre-recorded video panel that we want to share with you. We have the link up on the screen, and also it was sent out through all of the emails after you registered for the event. And it's called The Intersection of Health, Human Services, and Education Policy in 21. We've already talked about the theme of how education and health are so interconnected and how you can't have one without the other. And so this video that you can now view, I think we actually also have it up on our website, includes Elena Marks from the Episcopal Health Foundation, Stephanie Rubin from Texans Care for Children, Pam Wells from the Education Service Center Region 4, and Michelle Harper at the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute. And it's moderated by Ross Ramsey. It is a fantastic panel. We encourage you to watch it now or later, but you all have the next hour, a little less than an hour, to view that great presentation. And then we're going to come back together at 2 o'clock for a policy deep dive. This is the Educate Texas Philanthropy Advocates 21 policy agenda. You're going to have a chance to hear from multiple folks who've been involved in these efforts for many, many months. I do want to highlight that this will be a combination of presentation where we're all together, and then we're going to go into breakout sections. You all should have registered for those breakout sessions or identified which breakout session you want to participate in when you registered. So if you all have any, if you're so inclined to get back on a bit before 2, our folks can start putting you in those breakout rooms early, assigning you to those breakout rooms so that when it's time to do the breakout rooms, you're ready to go. So with that, I am going to close and just thank Emily one more time for her fantastic moderating. We are so pleased to have this partnership with the 19th News, and I have a feeling you're going to be seeing many more great things from Emily and her team. Oh, and one more thing. We are on social media. I've been tweeting away. I don't know about you guys. The hashtag is Philanthropy Advocates or Philanthropy Advocates, and that's the hashtag we'll be using for the next 2 days. So we will see you at 2 o'clock. Thanks.